If you want more forgotten the American position on Hill 488 but really collapsed to a circle barely 10 steps across. 6 men were dead. Every survivor was wounded. Staff Sergeant Jimmie Howard could no longer move his legs, and the men still conscious were firing one round at a time. Below them, several hundred North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops controlled the slopes. They were so close that American aircraft could not attack without risking the Marines on the summit. Then the grenades ran out. Howard gave an order that sounded absurd. Pick up rocks. Throw them into the darkness. When the enemy dives away from what he thinks is a grenade, make the shot count. And somehow it worked. But not for long. By dawn, according to a survivor's later account, the entire platoon had only 8 live rounds left. Helicopters still could not land. Daylight had come, but rescue had not. To understand how 16 Marines and 2 Navy corpsmen ended up here, we have to go back 2 days to a mission that was never supposed to become a battle. We also reconstructed the deadly Elzy-Albany ambush, the battle we were soldiers left out. I've linked it for after this story. Because on Hill 488, the first attack was only the beginning. In June 1966, American intelligence was watching a dangerous movement through the mountains west of Chu Lai. North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong forces were moving through the Hai Ha region, Tru Ajay region toward the populated coastal plain. They traveled in smaller groups, using steep valleys and broken terrain to hide their strength. If those groups were allowed to assemble unnoticed, they could strike Marine positions closer to the coast. The answer was Operation Kansas. Instead of sending a large force blindly into the mountains, the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion placed 7 small observation teams around the high ground overlooking Hai Ping and Nai Kai's Valley. Their mission was not to seize territory. It was to watch. From concealed positions, the reconnaissance Marines would identify movement, report it by radio, and call artillery or aircraft onto enemy concentrations. A few hidden men on the correct hill could direct more firepower than an entire infantry company could carry. But the system depended on one thing. The observers had to remain invisible. Staff Sergeant Jimmie Earl Howard's platoon drew the most isolated position of the operation, a barren summit marked on American maps only by its elevation. Hill 488. To the Vietnamese, it was Nui Vu. The hill rose roughly 1,600 feet above the surrounding country and dominated the valley for miles. From the top, Howard's men could see trails, villages, cultivated ground, and the routes used by enemy units moving east. It was an excellent observation post. It was also a terrible defensive position. The usable summit was less than 75 feet across at its widest point. Its shape resembled an uneven 3-bladed propeller. Short grass covered the crest, thicker grass grew farther down the slopes, and the only substantial cover was one large boulder near the top. There were no prepared bunkers, no neighboring American position. Beyond the hill, there was no friendly ground all the way toward Laos. Howard's force consisted of 16 Marines and 2 attached Navy corpsmen. Most were very young. Some had completed only a handful of reconnaissance patrols. Howard was different. At 36, he had already fought in Korea, where he had served as a forward observer, been wounded, and received the Silver Star. He had also taught counter-guerrilla warfare before arriving in Vietnam. That experience mattered because Hill 488 required 2 different kinds of leadership. First, Howard had to direct destructive force onto targets miles away. Then he would have to command a fight taking place only a few feet from his position. On June 13, H-34 helicopters inserted the platoon near the summit. Howard and Lance Corporal Ricardo Benz immediately organized fields of fire, assigned sectors, and selected the large boulder as a rally point if the outer positions had to collapse. That decision appeared routine. 2 nights later, it would keep the platoon from being divided and destroyed. For the next 2 days, the observers watched enemy movement through the valley. Using their radios, they called in artillery and airstrikes. Smoke columns rose from positions that enemy troops had believed were hidden. Each successful strike confirmed the value of Hill 488. It also made the hill more dangerous. The enemy did not need to see the Marines to understand that someone was watching. If a concealed unit moved and artillery arrived soon afterward, the pattern pointed back toward the high ground. By the evening of June 15, the reconnaissance mission had achieved exactly what it was designed to do, and that success had helped expose the men carrying it out. Night fell without a moon, That removed the platoon's last simple way out. The terrain around Hill 488 was too rough for a helicopter extraction in darkness. Whatever happened during the night, the 18 Americans would remain on the summit until daylight. At approximately 10 o'clock, a U.S. Special Forces patrol operating about 2 miles north of the hill spotted a large enemy formation moving toward Nuivu. The warning that reached Howard was direct. At least a battalion was approaching, and it appeared to be coming for him. A battalion was not a precise head count. Contemporary accounts differ over whether 200, 300, or a still larger force assembled around the hill. What mattered to Howard was that several hundred armed men were closing on 18 Americans who could not be extracted. Howard placed the platoon on alert. He reminded the men that if the outer positions failed, they were to fall back toward the large boulder. There was no room for a normal defensive line. The summit itself was too small. Once the enemy reached the top, every rifle would be protecting the man beside it. The warning gave Howard a few minutes. It did not give him a way out. On the northern side, Ricardo Benz watched the grass and brush below his position. Something that looked like a bush appeared to move across the slope. Benz fired. The shape rolled downhill. He and the Marine beside him withdrew toward the boulder as the darkness below the summit erupted with automatic fire. The enemy had intended to close on the observation post before revealing himself. Ben's shot destroyed that surprise, but it also began the battle. Grenades landed across the crest. Machine gun fire crossed the hill from several directions. Mortar rounds struck around the summit as attackers climbed through the grass. Howard ordered the outer positions inward. This was the first reason the platoon survived the opening assault. The men did not remain isolated around the three arms of the hill. They fought back toward a defensive point selected before the shooting began. The second reason was elevation. The enemy had numbers, darkness, automatic weapons, and mortars. The Marines held the top of the hill, forcing every assault to move uphill toward prepared sectors. The third was discipline. Howard's men carried M14 rifles, one M79 grenade launcher, several thousand rounds of rifle ammunition, and a limited supply of fragmentation grenades. That sounded substantial until hundreds of attackers began testing the perimeter from different directions. Automatic fire could empty the platoon's ammunition in minutes. Howard demanded aimed shots. The first assault failed to sweep over the summit. The Marines had answered the opening question. The position could be defended, but holding it once created a worse problem. The enemy now knew exactly where the Americans were, how small their perimeter was, and that no extraction aircraft could reach them until daylight. If you value the overlooked details behind America's military history, subscribe to Forgotten War Stories, because the first attack was only the beginning of what happened on Hill 488. After the initial attack, the enemy changed tactics. Instead of presenting one continuous target, smaller groups probed the edges of the position. They moved through the grass, waited for gaps in the illumination, and attacked whichever sector appeared weakest. The fighting became a cycle. American artillery could not safely fire high-explosive shells onto the summit because the opposing lines were already too close. The batteries instead fired illumination rounds over the hill. For a short time, a flare would turn the slopes into a pale circle of visible ground. The Marines could identify movement and fire, then the flare would burn out. Darkness returned, and the enemy moved again. Howard radioed his battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Sullivan, and asked for continuous light over the hill. The flares did more than reveal targets. They became the rhythm of survival. Light meant the Marines could see the attack coming. Darkness meant the next men might already be inside the perimeter. Casualties accumulated quickly. Private First Class James McKinney was killed early in the fighting. The M79 gunner, Thomas Powles, was critically wounded. 18-year-old Thomas Glaw took over the grenade launcher and continued firing until he too was killed. The two Navy corpsmen, Billy Holmes and Richard Fitzpatrick, moved among the wounded while grenades and automatic fire crossed the tiny summit. Fitzpatrick suffered a devastating wound. Holmes was wounded repeatedly, but continued treating Marines and pulling men toward the limited protection of the boulder. At one point, an attacker began dragging Holmes down the slope. Ray Hildreth saw what was happening in the light of a flare and stopped him. Holmes pulled himself back toward the position and continued working. This was no longer a fight between two clearly separated lines. The enemy was reaching into the perimeter. Lance Corporal John Adams covered other Marines as they withdrew toward the final defensive position. When his ammunition was gone, his Navy Cross citation records that he charged the attackers with his rifle as a club. His action gave the other men enough time to reach the rally point. Corporal Gerald Thompson was seized during the close fighting and pulled from the crest. He fought his attackers as they dragged him down the hill. He never returned to the summit. Howard's original perimeter was disappearing one man at a time. The remaining defenders compressed around the large boulder. Every time the circle became smaller, there were fewer sectors to cover, but fewer rifles available to cover them. By now, Howard was asking to get his men out. The answer remained unchanged. No helicopter could enter that darkness, find a landing point on the rough summit, and remain exposed while hundreds of enemy troops covered the slopes. They would have to survive until daylight. Aircraft began circling Hill 488, but finding safe targets was almost impossible. The Marines and their attackers were sometimes separated by only a few yards. From above, in darkness and smoke, the pilots could not simply distinguish one line from another. Howard became the connection between the men on the ground and the firepower in the sky. He used the radio and, according to battle accounts, a filtered light to help identify his position. Aircraft attacked so close to the summit that a small error could destroy the platoon they were trying to save. The strikes forced enemy troops away from portions of the crest. But air power created a dangerous new geometry. Pilots could saturate the slopes farther down. They could not strike the narrow ring immediately beside the Marines without hitting Americans. The attackers recognized that protected space and moved into it, hugging the perimeter where American aircraft were least useful. Every strike pushed the surviving enemy closer. Every pause allowed another assault. Marine A-4 Skyhawks and armed helicopters alternated attacks around the summit. Rockets, bombs, cannon fire, and machine gun rounds tore into the slopes, sometimes landing only meters from Howard's men. Yet the platoon still had to defend the final distance with rifles and grenades. Then Howard was hit. Fragments, or a projectile, struck his back and left him unable to move his legs. Accounts say he refused morphine because he feared losing the alertness needed to command the defense and direct aircraft. He gave his remaining ammunition to his men, and he stayed on the radio. That division of responsibility became the hidden mechanism holding the platoon together. Howard continued directing air support and controlling the defense. Benz, wounded in both legs and elsewhere, moved through the perimeter gathering ammunition from the dead and from men no longer able to fire. He redistributed those rounds to the Marines who remained conscious and able to use them. Holmes continued treating casualties. The surviving riflemen protected the corpsmen, the wounded, the radio, and each other. No single act held Hill 488. The position survived because different men kept separate parts of the defense functioning after its leader could no longer move. But the system had a hard limit. They could redistribute ammunition. They could not create more of it. Between assaults, voices rose from below the hill. The enemy called to the Marines in English, telling them they would die before the night ended. The message was not an empty threat. The attackers could hear the American fire becoming slower. They knew the perimeter had contracted. They knew wounded men were calling for corpsmen inside it. Howard understood that the enemy was listening for more than gunfire. They were listening for fear. He told his Marines to laugh, not politely, not nervously. He ordered what the men called an old horse laugh, loud enough for everyone below to hear. The surviving defenders began laughing into the darkness. It was an act of defiance, but it also served a tactical purpose. A force preparing to collapse did not sound like that. To the attackers below, the laughter suggested that the Americans might be stronger, less damaged, or more confident than expected. Decades later, a former Vietnamese officer who had taken part in the attack told survivor Ray Hildreth that the sound was disturbing. His men could not understand why soldiers in a hopeless position were laughing. The laughter did not stop the battle. It changed the information the enemy believed it was receiving, and then American aircraft arrived in greater strength. Howard directed them to strike everything immediately outside the shrinking summit. The defensive circle now extended only about 10 steps from one side to the other. The safe margins separating American from enemy positions had almost disappeared. The attacks cost the force below heavily, but surviving enemy troops continued crawling into the narrow ring the aircraft could not touch. Howard's men were now conserving every cartridge. Enemy automatic weapons answered with bursts. The Marines replied with single shots. Then the last fragmentation grenades were thrown. The enemy still had grenades. The Marines had stones scattered across the hilltop. That was when Howard issued the order that would become the defining detail of Hill 488. The rocks were never meant to injure the attackers. They were meant to control them. In darkness, a grenade and a stone produced the same first warning, the sound of a hard object landing nearby. A soldier who waited to identify which one it was might not survive the answer. Howard told his men to throw rocks down the slope. When an attacker heard the impact, instinct would force him to move away or rise from cover. That movement would expose him for the fraction of a second needed by a Marine holding an M14. The deception worked. A stone landed. An enemy soldier moved. One carefully aimed round followed. For a few moments, an 18-man platoon had turned the attacker's own expectation against them. The enemy had more men, more ammunition, and more grenades. But in the darkness immediately outside the perimeter, he could not know which sound was harmless. The trick also revealed how close the platoon was to destruction. You throw false grenades only when the real ones are gone. You wait for one exposed target only when you cannot afford two shots. And deception lasts only until the opponent recognizes the pattern. The eastern sky slowly began to lighten. Daybreak changed the advantage. The enemy could no longer approach unseen, and American aircraft could identify movement more easily. Accounts from the battle say Howard marked the arrival of morning by calling out reveille from the shattered perimeter, another signal to the enemy that the Marines on the summit were still organized. The attacking force began pulling back from the exposed crest, removing many of its casualties and leaving others behind. According to Hildreth's later account, the 12 surviving members of the platoon now possessed only 8 live rifle rounds among them. They had survived the night. They had not yet escaped the hill. From the summit, daylight revealed what darkness had concealed. The defensive position had almost ceased to exist. 6 members of the 18-man team were dead or missing and later confirmed killed. Every survivor had been wounded. Only a few could move without being carried. The slopes still contained enemy automatic weapons positions. Any helicopter attempting to land would have to slow over the same small summit the enemy had been trying to capture all night. When evacuation aircraft approached, Howard initially warned them away. His Medal of Honor citation records that he called for additional airstrikes and directed the remaining fire of his platoon onto enemy weapons to make the landing area safer. The danger was real. During the continuing effort to support and evacuate the reconnaissance team, Major William Goodsell brought an armed helicopter into the fight. His aircraft was struck, and Goodsell later died from his wounds. Other aircrew members were also lost during the battle. The men in the sky were not observing Hill 488 from safety. They were entering the same defensive system, using their aircraft to attack, identify positions, distract enemy gunners, and create the few seconds required for another aircraft to approach. At approximately 10 in the morning, Marines from Company C, 1st Battalion 5th Marines reached the southern side of the hill by helicopter. They fought through remaining resistance and opened the route needed to remove Howard's platoon. The survivors were evacuated. 18 Americans had gone onto Hill 488, 16 Marines and 2 Navy corpsmen, 12 came off alive. The 6 who did not were John Adams, Ignatius Carlisi, Thomas Glaub, James McKinney, Alcadio Mascarenhas, and Gerald Thompson. The battle had continued for roughly 12 hours. Enemy losses are much less certain than later summaries sometimes suggest. More than 40 bodies were reported left near the hill, while official American estimates credited the combined ground and air action with far more, in some accounts approximately 200. Many casualties were removed during the withdrawal, and no exact total can now be established. That uncertainty does not weaken what happened. The achievement was not that 18 men single-handedly destroyed an entire battalion. It was that a reconnaissance team, isolated on terrain it was never meant to defend, prevented a much larger force from overrunning it until air support and relief could reach the position. Hill 488 is often reduced to one impossible ratio, 18 men against a battalion, but numbers alone do not explain why 12 survived. They survived because a Special Forces patrol provided a warning before the first assault, because Howard had selected a final rally point before contact, because the outer teams withdrew instead of being destroyed separately, because the Marines controlled their fire while the enemy tried to make them waste ammunition, because artillery crews kept flares over the hill, because pilots delivered weapons dangerously close to the summit, because 2 Navy corpsmen continued treating casualties after they had become casualties themselves, because Benz redistributed the last ammunition while Howard, unable to move his legs, continued controlling aircraft over the radio, And when conventional options disappeared, they used sound, laughter, stones, and the enemy's own expectations as weapons. The decorations reflected that collective effort. Howard received the Medal of Honor. Ricardo Benz and Corpsman Billy Holmes received the Navy Cross. John Adams and Gerald Thompson received the Navy Cross posthumously. The other 13 members of the platoon received Silver Stars. It became one of the most highly decorated small units in American military history. Howard's medal citation did not celebrate a body count. It credited his organization, leadership, radio control, and refusal to abandon the defense after he was severely wounded. Most importantly, it stated that his actions were largely responsible for preventing the loss of the entire platoon. That is the real measure of Hill 488, not how many enemy soldiers American reports claimed were killed. How many Americans a competent leader and a disciplined team managed to bring home from a position that should have consumed all of them. 45 years after the battle, survivor Ray Hildreth returned to Nuivu. The grass had grown over old scars in the ground, but the large boulder was still there. It marked a place where Howard had kept the radio, where the wounded had been gathered, and where the platoon's world had contracted to a circle only a few steps wide. Hildreth met former Vietnamese participants in the battle, including an officer whose men had climbed the hill that night. Men who had once tried to kill one another returned as old veterans, carrying different memories of the same darkness. The most famous order from Hill 488 was simple: throw rocks. But the rocks were only the final expression of everything that had come before them: preparation before contact, discipline under fire, trust after the chain of command was wounded, and the refusal to give the enemy the fear he expected to hear. At dawn, the survivors had 8 live rounds. What they had in greater supply was the reason any of them were still alive. They were still functioning as a platoon. And on Hill 48, that was enough to keep 18 isolated Americans from disappearing in the dark. For another forgotten Vietnam battle that Hollywood left behind, watch our story of the deadly ambush that we were soldiers never showed.